Hello and welcome. I'm Catherine Maggs, and this is Continuing the Conversation, a series dedicated specifically to continuing the conversation on International Women's Day themes. It's been 2 months since we held International Women's Day, and things have got a little quiet. So this series discusses the current campaign theme of International Women's Day through interviewing amazing humans around the world to better understand what it means to them and their individual circumstances, how they see it play out in their life, and what they're doing both personally and within their organisations to create real change. Today I'm chatting with Elizabeth Robinson. Elizabeth is a Disability Institute leader with a strong background in education and over 35 years foreign language teaching experience in both Australia and overseas. But her life changed in 2015 when she acquired a rare neurological syndrome, Ramsay-Hunt syndrome. This resulted in permanent facial paralysis and hearing loss on her left side. Due to the lack of awareness, medical and emotional support for people with facial paralysis, she founded the online support group Bell's Palsy and Facial Paralysis Support Network Australia, New Zealand, the world. Elizabeth is now an internationally recognised facial palsy advocate and face equality ally. She organised the inaugural Australian Facial Paralysis Awareness Day in 2020 and has written articles and spoken on radio, television and podcasts in Australia, America and the UK. So join us as we discuss the importance of asking questions. That's becoming a recurring theme. But also why we're afraid to ask questions. The challenges that we face with tokenisation and patriarchy, and how popular TV and progressive movements are muddying the waters and confusing our younger generation. And also, is kindness the answer? So let's get chatting. Welcome, Elizabeth, to Continuing the Conversation. So incredibly grateful to have you with us today. Very excited about the conversation we're about to have.
Thank you. I feel very privileged to be on here and I've been looking forward to it.
Oh, you're most welcome, most welcome. So we might as well just get straight into it. When you're talking to people about equity and embracing equity, what is the biggest piece of advice that you have for them?
Interesting question. Probably the advice that I wish I'd been given. And that is that we all have to start somewhere. And even though I'm a disability leader, don't belong to any organisation. Well, I do belong to the Disability Leader Institute, but I'm a grassroots agitator. So when I'm talking, a lot of it is when I started was gleaning from what other people were saying and what I was reading. So I think my biggest advice is to read and not be afraid to ask the questions, because terminology is changing all the time. And what we may have seen before as the buzzword was equality.
Yes.
And now we're understanding more that in order to achieve equality, we have to have equity.
That's right.
And a lot of these terms I found when I was starting out, and even now, I do find they can be slightly confusing. And I think sometimes people's definitions can vary, especially when it comes in the disability world, when we're talking about ableism and other issues. And again, I think it gets back to don't be afraid to ask the questions.
Yeah.
Don't be afraid to make mistakes and to say, I don't know what that means, or why should we be using that term? How can we improve the situation? How can I better my understanding of what's happening, not just around me, but in the world in general?
Yeah. And I love that, grassroots agitator. I love that definition. It's brilliant. But something that's been coming up over and over again is don't be afraid to ask questions. Don't be afraid to ask. Why are we? Why do we fear asking questions? Is there an element of ego that I should already know this? Or
I think it's probably left over from childhood and from school that I think it is ego, and people don't want to appear stupid and feel that and I think some people, feel that they should know what this means, or they should know the answer to the question. But it's all about education and growing.
yeah,
And because my background is in education as a teacher, something I would encourage my students is to ask. And I really admire people. I've got a very close friend that if we're talking and someone uses a word she doesn't know, she'll just say very calmly, "What does that mean?"
yeah,
And it's so refreshing because
yeah. And
there's no shame in saying, "What does that mean?"
no, you're right. And you're right. I think there is an element of it's autopilot, but I wish I knew what in our conditioning created that. Because I find myself sometimes people talk about and I'll say something and I just nod and then I go, hang on a minute, I don't know what that is. And I'll go, actually, can you explain that a bit more? I don't actually know what you're talking about. But it's that automatic reaction. When you might be passing someone that's having a conversation or in the workplace or wherever it might be, and you hear them talking about equity, how does that make you feel?
Well, this is an incredibly interesting and timely question. I actually don't work because I'm medically retired. So my work is based in advocacy for people with facial paralysis. I run a support group with over 1,000 people, and it's agitating the government for change, etc. So my answer is probably twofold to that question. Recently, I was involved in a hackathon with Service New South Wales.
Brilliant.
So that was probably, I think, one of the most exciting and fulfilling events that I've ever taken part in, was to be with, there are, I think, close to, over the day, almost 200 people working together to what we were working on was to develop an accessibility card, which I can talk about later if it's appropriate. Victor Dominello, Minister for Digital Services, has since announced on both LinkedIn and Facebook that the card will be going to pilot. So I'm no longer bound by the government secrecy of I wasn't allowed to talk about it.
Congratulations. How exciting.
Very, very exciting, very exciting. And that it will be expanded to include people with other conditions, not just facial paralysis and stroke and epilepsy. So to be in a room full of people of the energy who are working towards inclusion, acceptance, and equity, mainly here for the facial differences community and disability community, it was beyond. It was an adrenaline rush, and to have people wanting to know, to know that these people are working for the New South Wales government, whatever the government is, be it Liberal or Labor, and they have our backs.
Yeah.
And they want to make improvements. It gives one so much hope.
Yeah.
For the world and for New South Wales. Yeah.
Oh, that's amazing. Such exciting and important work. Really, and it's people like you, our grassroots agitators,
that
make this stuff happen, right? Like we quite often wonder as an individual, as a one person, how can I change the world? But you can, and if we don't speak up and we don't have a voice, then things will never change.
And I think that's an important word that you said there, to step up. We have to step up, and we have to believe in ourselves, that within us is the power to make change. I think often people think that, and which I know when I was talking, I was saying, oh, it's just me, I'm no one. And I got quickly picked up on that. It was like, don't ever say that about yourself.
Yeah.
But what I meant was, well, I'm not a CEO. I'm not I don't have a role in an organization as a disability leader, but it has given me that confidence, and also that confidence to encourage other people to, you can make change. You can step up, and we can do it together. But
Mm.
we do have to do it together, and we do have to support each other. I think the biggest block in achieving the equality and the which is the ultimate goal, that equity, are people's different egos,
Mm.
and also that terrible thing that we have in Australia, tall poppy syndrome.
Yes.
Cut down, and I think it's also accepting that any change, no matter how small it is good.
Yeah.
Positive change.
That's right.
So that's the positive one that makes my heart sing.
Yeah.
I did have an interesting experience pre-voting. In New South Wales, we've got our state election, and I went to the pre-voting because I won't be here on Saturday morning.
Yes.
And the one party is normally in power where I live. That's just been traditional. And so I decided to speak to the other candidate. I was speaking to the woman who was handing out the voting forms.
Yes.
And she said, "Oh, the candidate is here. You can speak to her." I said, "Fantastic." So I went up and introduced myself. And the first question was, "Well, what are you planning to do? Why should I vote for you? What are you planning to do for the people of XYZ area?"
Yep.
And I got the usual spiel.
Yeah.
And I thought, I'm actually asking that when I'm a disability leader. So I then said, well, actually, my main question is, I said, as a disability leader and facial paralysis advocate, I said, what are you planning to do to help the disabled community of this area? And that was interesting because for me, my area of equity is the diversity and inclusion of disabilities. So, because it's such a huge umbrella, equity.
Yes.
So I'm just going to focus on that one there. And I got the usual spiel. The first words were talking about ramps. And I said, "Oh, well, that's interesting." I said, because I said, disability is not just about ramps. I said, it's about visible and invisible disabilities. And I said, we all automatically go to wheelchairs and ramps, but I said, there's a lot more to it than that.
Yeah.
And I said, so apart from making sure the ramps are, I said, what else are they planning to do? And the words that came out of her mouth was, our goal is to ensure that people with disabilities are integrated into society. And I actually said, I'm going to stop you there. I said, just so you know, I said, if you're talking about disability and to the disability community, I said, we do not need integrating into society. I said, I am already integrated into society. I said, what we need is inclusion, acceptance, and to be treated with respect and dignity. So I said, just please make sure moving forward, I said, don't ever use that word.
Yeah.
I didn't, don't. I said, please avoid using that word. I said, it's actually, it's actually quite offensive.
And it's interesting how the use of a word can completely change the tone of or the meaning. I would imagine initially you probably caught her off guard anyway. She probably wasn't expecting
definitely.
to have to answer questions about the topic of inclusion of, both invisible and visible disabilities. So I think you probably caught her off guard already, but how important is it to, when we are, and again, back to our other conversation, when we're talking about something we may not have all the answers or education on, it's okay to say, not have an answer and say, you ask a really important question and rightly or wrongly, I don't have all the answers, but I'd love to catch up with you at some point and learn more about what your thoughts are. Like, even something like that, right? How would have that conversation went so differently if she responded in that way?
Yes. And that's interesting. She did by the end of the conversation say, if I'm elected, I'd love you to, arrange a meeting and maybe we could talk more and learn more of your expertise. And I totally agree. And it sort of contradicts what I said earlier about not necessarily knowing the terms. But I do think if someone is running for Parliament, I think all our politicians that there is a minimum that they need to be educated on, and to ensure that they are using correct terms.
Yeah.
And especially as I pointed out a statistic to her, that approximately, they say it's 18.5, America says it's 25. So I'm going to settle for 20. So approximately 20% of the Australian population have either a disability, visible or invisible, or a chronic illness. But when that statistic goes between 18 and 65, and between 18 and 65, I think is a very important number, because obviously that's the voting age.
Yes.
And the consumer age.
Yes.
And the working age. That number jumps to 40%.
Oh, wow.
40%. Now that's documented in the Australian, sorry, I can't remember the exact name of it, but it's in the report of Australian disabilities. So it's not something I've just pulled out of the air. And I remember when I read it, I thought it's very well.
I had no idea it was that high.
But what it means is that people with disabilities are the largest minority group in the world. But let's just stick to Australia for the moment. Yeah. That makes us the largest minority group in Australia. And where it makes it quite interesting when it comes to equity, therefore it makes us the largest intersectionality group. So it doesn't matter your gender, sexual orientation, your economic status, your race, your cultural background. We're all there. So it's for me, that makes a very important group, that we have people with disabilities are largely ignored and marginalized, but because it contains such diversity, such it's probably, it's not only the largest minority group, it's the biggest group of diversity.
The most diverse minority group. Yeah.
Yes, that it really needs a lot more attention.
So on that topic, and you were talking more specifically from a political point of view, and an up and coming potential political candidate. But in general, whether it's politics or whether it's our organizations, how do we get everybody, like especially leadership down, right? The CEOs, the executive leadership, how do we get them all on board with understanding, A, the importance of embracing equity, but B, actually opening arms and literally embracing equity?
It's the $1 million question, isn't it?
I know, but we've got the answers, surely, or between all of us. I mean,
I think it gets back to the leadership we need. We need good leadership. We need to see more female leaders, and again, especially in Parliament. I mean, it's woeful, Australia's track record with women in politics. We need to see more women leaders in politics. We need to see more women leaders in business. And we need to see more people with disabilities in leadership roles. And we need, and again, this is just me. I'm not a business person. I'm not a CEO. I'm not versed in my backgrounds from politics or management or business management, but just from observation and experience, and now becoming more involved in in the diversity and equity movement by default, almost, from acquiring disability, and seeing that change was needed. That, for example, my area, people with facial paralysis, little was known about it. There was no psychological support. There's no social support, and So my answer is quite multifarious, and I think the approach has to be that it has to come from a lot of different angles.
Yeah.
And I know they can't be the answers to everything, but I think it has to come from the government, from the top down, the leader of Australia, and then within each state, it has to come from the premier. And then I think in schools, I think we need a massive education campaign on more, and have been teachers seeing more social justice issues, and that awareness starting from a very young age.
Yeah.
And not being tokenistic. But I know it's impossible as an educator. Schools, we can't fall on the shoulders of teachers. They have to cover an awful lot.
They do, yeah.
But I think room can be made for it.
So how do we avoid being tokenistic, right? Because it happens, and even and I know the conversation of equity and diversity and inclusion is significantly broader than just gender. But I think about, a decade ago, almost maybe 2 decades ago, when the whole conversation around gender equity first started and diversity inclusion first started. And so one of the original strategies was to have quotas. And that tokenizes, right? Because you then find yourself at the mercy of being accused of you're only there because you're female. You're only there because you've got a disability. You're only there because of your race. So how can we build this without that tokenization? Do you think it's possible?
I think probably long term it is, but it reminds me of I used to lecture in legal English, American law, and English law, and political science. And one of the topics that was covered was in America, segregation, and with the bus quotas and school quotas. And in order to fight that systemic racism, systemic discrimination, systemic bias, systemic everything, I don't know what the answer is, but I think we maybe do have to start somewhere, and so be it. If it's such a hard one, because I know there's a lot of talk in the facial differences world about film parts in Hollywood, and et cetera, and how people with facial differences need to be included, et cetera. And part of me is, well, there's also got to be merit for it.
Yeah.
There's got to be merit. So I don't know, you read the stories of a candidate going, and if they had a choice between a female candidate and a male candidate, well, we're going to choose the female, even though she might not be fully qualified as the male, because we need to get that quota. Is that fair? I don't know. So it's a big question, and I don't really know if my answers are valid or have merit, but I think
they're still in a point of view, and that's
my point of view. Yeah,
the whole point of having the conversation is that we can get these different perspectives and different point of views, and hopefully between all of us, we come up with some good ideas and some good strategies, but also along the way we start help educating and potentially changing the perspectives of others.
I think, as you said, continuing the conversation. I love it that this is what you call a series, because it is a series of conversations, isn't it? And I found, even by going on LinkedIn and meeting with new people, that the more conversations you have, the more your ideas change, and the more it's like watering little seeds starts to
exactly
bloom.
right. In your opinion, what do you think one of the biggest challenges is, or the most common challenge, I should say, in creating equity and diversity?
Dare I say it? privileged white men.
You can
Well, I'm going to say it. I think that really is the biggest challenge. And yeah, I think we still live in a very patriarchal society, and yeah.
We do. And before we lose any listeners, this isn't about bagging white men. This is about understanding that our fundamental frameworks and structures and culture are built on patriarchy.
Yeah.
And although we've come a long way, it still exists in our society. In fact, it still exists in our systems. It was only 2000, you'd probably be more aware of this than I am, being in New South Wales, but it was only 2019 that New South Wales legalised abortion. 2019.
It was very late. It was very late.
And to say, you, woman, have the right to choose what you want to do with your body. So we are, a lot of our systems are still built on that original framework. Our laws take a long time to catch up to society, even from, you think about our technology and the laws around that, like it takes a very long time to catch up. So we do still very much live in a patriarchal society. And unfortunately, we still have, I do a lot of work with male champions in helping them understand how they can help, women progress and help women with their confidence and that kind of stuff in the business world. And I ask them a lot of challenging questions, like, how did you grow up? Did you grow up in mum stayed at home, dad worked? Or if both parents worked, who did most of the housework? And who did most of the outdoor work? So, it's still ingrained in our genetics, and it's only through these conversations that we start to be able to unpack that and have those aha moments and realize, wow, you're right. And, the other question I ask men is, you're all for equity, but when you're in a situation where a woman's not being included, or any minorities, not that women are minority, but any minorities not being included, do you find yourself sitting back and just going with the flow, or do you actually put your hand up and go, oh, hang on, Sarah had an idea around that, let's listen to that? So we have these conditionings without even knowing it, and without these conversations, we're not going to unpack that.
No, and I mean that in the young, I see in the young men of his generation starting to change. In the younger generation, the way they treat and talk about women and the respect. But I think it's something also in the genetics that they've grown up so long and what they've observed that.
Yeah, it definitely is. And you put another layer on top of that around the term. I don't necessarily like the term, but I don't have an alternative at this point in time. But, toxic masculinity, you put that layer on top where, some men feel pressured that they have to support the family. It's their responsibility to look after the family financially and physically, and, create a safe environment for them. And that in itself creates all sorts of complexity as well.
It's very, very complex. I mean, one just even has to look at, social media and popular TV. I mean, I'm hooked on Married at First Sight, but it's very an interesting capsule of the toxic masculinity that comes out.
Yes.
And even so unaware of it.
And they are themselves as well, I'm sure.
Yeah. Oh, they are. They are. I think they're totally unaware of it. And then, and then the most emotionally intelligent man on the series is sort of constantly being put down.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yet he's probably the most emotionally intelligent person.
Mm.
So I think too gets back to then, as a saying, and then men thinking they have to, and then it gets back to when we talk about equity and diversity, the whole problems with mental health.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. Good point. It weaves into that quite. I mean, there's an absolute direct correlation between some of our cultural conditioning and we've got this conflict, right? We've got our genetic condition, our environmental conditioning and the way things should be. But then we've also got a society who's generationally trying to move away from that. And you just have this constant internal conflict, which has a direct impact on your mental health. Definitely.
And, it's interesting because, I mean, I don't know if this is sort of appropriate to the equity conversation, but I'm of that generation. I'm turning 62 soon, where I look at the Me Too movement. And whilst I think it was very important and incredible what has happened out of it, there's also been a lot of damage done. And I know that people say, oh, when men go, oh, it's not fair, etc. But I see it with my nephew and the young men around him that they sometimes talk to me and go, we are really confused. Because I find that the younger women, I'm talking, say, 18 to 25, don't fully, because they haven't gone through the women's liberation and the equality, and that they've grasped onto this, and they have turned it a little bit as being against, this is how I'm perceiving a lot of people around, anti-men, and that's not what it's about.
No, you're right. And
there's that toxic masculinity. Sometimes I see toxic femininity.
Yes, and it exists. 100% it exists. And I don't think it matters what type of movement is created, especially when you're I'm going to use this word over and over again.
Grassroots agitator.
When you're a grassroots agitator, doesn't matter what type of movement you create with an intent, with a pure intent, it will always be taken by the left and by the right and turned into something else. It always will happen. And that then always creates, as you say, a confusion. And I think our young people have every right to be confused, because of all of those conflicting messages and that conflict in our environment and how we've been culturally conditioned and the way the world is moving.
And please, I don't want any listeners to misunderstand and think I'm anti the Me Too movement. I'm not. It was incredibly important and powerful.
Elizabeth, probably a completely different direction in the conversation. But what approach do you take when you're trying to understand different perspectives from different backgrounds, gender choices, whatever it might be, when you're looking at how do you approach that?
Again, a question that needs reflection, and a very interesting question, because that is at the root of it all, isn't it? That it's our lived experience and our personal approaches that are going to make effective and positive change. I think for me, how I approach it is I was very fortunate in that I grew up in a household. I think my mother, for her time, was very ahead of her time, in that, so I was growing up in the 60s and 70s, and my father at the time worked for Qantas, and they had lived overseas for a long time in both Papua New Guinea and Fiji.
Yeah.
And my father was Northern Irish and my mother was half Northern Irish. So I grew up as an Australian, but with parents who'd had this lived experience of not just Northern Ireland and sort of a more British way of living, but then having had the experience of living in both Papua New Guinea and Fiji, and our household was open. We were always having people from different countries, from different cultures. I remember at the time my mother prescribed to a magazine, I've forgotten what it was called. I think it was called China something or other. And she was accused by people of being a communist because she was interested in China and opening up. So I grew up in an environment I remember too, I'll never forget it, that I grew up in what's called the Shine. It was very bushy and very hot. And one day there was a knock at the door, and the Mormons who were coming around in those days a lot more than now. They were two young men. And it's my brother's birthday. I'll never forget it. It's my brother's 14th birthday. And they said, come in, my mother says, come in and have some lemonade and cake. They used to come around all the time. Yeah. So then, we're introduced to this American Mormon. They love coming around. My mother treated them like, they're very young, like like young boys. So always coming around for dinner and things. So from a very young age, exposed to all this difference, and also the benefit of traveling quite a lot internationally. And then at school, I went on and later studied French. So I think my whole personality and makeup is one of curiosity and discovery and acceptance by the way I was brought up, and then by studying a foreign language and living in France.
Yeah. Beautiful.
It's almost, it's who I am.
And what a beautiful way to be. Curious and open, and I love it. I love it. How do you handle situations where someone is actually being culturally insensitive or racist or homophobic? How do you deal with that?
I have a saying, and I was told this once when I was teaching by a colleague, was to sometimes you have to pick the battles that are worth getting out of the trenches for in order to win the war.
Yeah.
So sometimes I will assess the situation, and even though I might find it terribly offensive, and if I know that no matter what I say is not going to really change their opinion and could end up in an argument, and if I'm a guest somewhere, I will let it slide. If it is someone who's close to me, or if I think that it's important enough, like I do with a politician, to pull them up on what they said, I will. I do try and do it in as gentle way as possible.
Do you think as a society we need to be braver? We need to be braver and have these conversations and pull people up? Like I said, like you said, some situations it's potentially not appropriate, especially if, you would, you fear for your safety if you thought that they were aggressive or something like that. But in general, where it's probably a reasonably safe environment, whether it's the work environment, or do we need to be braver?
Yes. Yes. But I know because I admin this it's a facial paralysis network, support network for people and across the world. And when I wrote up to about the interaction with the politician.
Yeah.
And I get people commenting saying, "You're so brave. Good on you. Thank you. You're always standing up for us. You're a leader." And sometimes when I have people say to me, like, you were really brave doing that, I think, was I?
Yeah.
And I think it does sometimes to be able to, it does take a certain amount, I think, of bravery and resilience to be able to say something and to pull someone up and to do it effectively in a way that is not rude or aggressive.
Yeah.
Um, and
that's a skill to be able to have that conversation. I always say that conflict is not a bad thing. So long as it's constructive.
Yes.
It's constructive and it's coming from a place of good intent and not, anger or resentment or jealousy or anything like that. If it's coming from good intent, whether it be education or trying to get someone to see a different side of the story, then conflict is good. Constructive conflict is good.
And I would also add, I think, depending on the scenario, conflict without aggression.
Yes.
That I do unfortunately see within the facial differences community. There are some advocates who, or they prefer to call themselves activists, who can be quite aggressive with people.
Yeah.
And you see it on social media and you see it on, on Twitter and TikTok, and it's like, we don't need to.
We can be passionate without aggression, and we can get our point across without aggression. I agree.
I'm going to say something you might find out of left field. Kindness. I think if we want to create that world of inclusion and acceptance and respect and dignity, at the root of it all has to be kindness.
Yeah.
And treating people with kindness.
It's not that much left wing, really. I mean, it's about coming back to heart, isn't it? It's about coming back to who we are as human beings. And
out of left field, and that it might not have been the answer that you were expecting.
No, I know, but it's such a, how do I put it? It's core to our being, and we've lost our way as a society, as a humanity. We are so disconnected from ourselves that we don't we disassociate with everything, and we stop feeling and we stop caring because we've just become so disassociated. The visuals we see constantly, the stories we constantly hear, we become desensitized, and we don't want to feel because it hurts too much. So we've completely disassociated from our bodies, but it's all about coming back to center and remembering that we're all human beings.
I know, and I think when, for fear of saying the C word, COVID, I think when COVID started, there was this whole government campaign of we're all in this together. And I don't know what happened, but it just, I think I think COVID did bring some people closer. I know it brought my neighbours and I closer because I used to make food and we take it up to each other and check in on each other. And, it did bring a lot of us closer together, but I think it tore a lot of people apart.
I think you're right.
And I don't think we've recovered from it. I really don't. I think now in this post-COVID, although it's not post-COVID, it's still around.
And to your point, I think there is a percentage of the population that really woke up during that period. But having said that, it was a period of 2-3 years in comparison to decades of habitual behavior of being disassociated and disconnected and numbing. And so when you're trying to overcome decades that's ingrained in your DNA and your genes, 3 years isn't enough, 2 years isn't enough for the majority of people. So we have seen change in many, many people. But to your point, it was very easy when the world went back to normal, or normal, I should have put normal, not the world, in inverted commas, when we came back to
And what is normal?
exactly. People just reverted back to what was familiar, what was easy. But I think you're right. I think kindness is a beautiful way to look at it. Elizabeth, thank you so much for your time today. I've loved speaking with you and getting your perspective and your angle on things. It's been absolutely amazing. I'm incredibly grateful to have you with me today.
Oh, no, thank you. I feel very uplifted after this conversation. Thank you. I will admit I was a bit nervous coming into it. I was myself from anxiety, but it's beautiful, and it's beautiful knowing that you are continuing the conversation, and inviting people on, and as you said, it's by talking that things. So thank you very much. Thank you.